All right, we've got everybody present, I think. I'm gonna, let's see.
Hang on, I don't see Jonathan. Jonathan
No, we don't have Jonathan. You're
said
right.
he's on. Is Jonathan the number?
He told me last night he would be joining by phone and not video. He would be on the road.
Yeah, I wonder if the number that's posted is him.
I allowed the 806.
Hey guys,
Them.
that's me. Thank
Okay.
thank y'all.
Cool.
We've got Jonathan?
Yes.
Sure,
Okay.
I'm here.
Okay, great.
There he is.
All right,
That's me, guys. I'm here.
it's 10:07. I'm gonna call our meeting to order. First thing I want to do, I know coming out of the last meeting, Andy had posed some questions Jeff was going to bring answers to. I'd like to let Jeff address that first.
Sure. And Andy and I talked briefly last night, and what I said is we would bring a few example cities of what they've done and what kind of decisions they made. So I was going to walk you through. I brought 5 today, and I was just going to walk you through, if that's okay. Andy expressed that may want to wait a little bit until for this discussion for council. But if you want us to continue, I can give you those 5 examples now. Kind of up to the group. Well, I'll start with Midland.
I'm sorry. Can I jump in real quick?
Sure.
Yes, ma'am. Kelly?
Citizen comments on the agenda, which I don't know if we have any or not, but if we could handle that item real quick, that'd be great.
Kelly, I'm so sorry. I made the assumption we did not because I had not heard differently. Mike, do we have any citizen comments?
With all that's going on, I forgot. I'm checking right now. Hang on one second.
Thank you, Thomas.
Well, thanks for pointing that out, Kelly.
We do not have any citizen comments.
All right. With that said, then I'll move on and back to Jeff. Andy, Jeff asked a question whether or not you wanted to postpone his presentation on this. Do you, or are you okay for him to go ahead and do that?
Since he's got it teed up, let's hear what he's got. I think my comment to Jeff last night was it's difficult to well, and you'll probably address this, Thomas, but with a delay or a postponement on our report that we can't change, I think I was a little hesitant to get too far out ahead of where the council is discussing rates and discounts when we don't even really know where they're going to land. But if he's got 5 examples and it won't take too long and can get us further along in our brainstorming, then I'm fine to hear what he's got.
All right. Anybody else object to that? Okay, Jeff, I'm going to turn it over to you for a little bit.
I'm going to start with the city of Midland, which is the West City. They did a study very similar to you. And I'm going to try to do this. I'm going to explain. As you are aware, state law has the calculation where we take that 50% number. So when I explain this, some cities did the 50% credit calculation very similar to you. Some actually did another calculation. So I'm going to explain the difference when I talk about it. But Midland chose to adopt for the rate. They chose to adopt the 50% rate for residential, and then they gave a 25% discount to, I'm sorry, 50% rate for non-residential, and then they gave a 25% discount for residential. That was really their decision on the rate side. The other decision that they made was on the date side. They gave the extended grace period for residential, for residential developments, which they defined residential developments, for lack of better words, were single family townhome and duplex, not multifamily. So it was specifically defined as not the entire residential list. It was just the single family townhome and duplex, but they gave them a grace period of 2 years as opposed to the 1 year required grace period by law. So the only decisions that Midland made were, on the rate, they gave a discount, if you will, from the 50% or the maximum they could They knocked that down 25% for residential, and they extended the effective date for residential for those categories. Any questions on Midland?
So the cutting in half is the 50%, which is how you've been showing us
Yep.
the calculations on max fee, which
Correct.
that place for residential and non-residential. But then there was an additional 25% discount for residential.
That's correct.
Jeff, I have a question. I want to be sure we understand. You said they extended the grace period, and then later you said they extended the effective date. Those are two totally separate issues we need to understand clearly. So which one did they do?
Sorry, the effective date was almost effective immediately. They extended the grace period for 2 years.
Thank you very much.
Good. All right, the next example I had is Fort Worth. This example, they did things a little bit differently. So I'm going to explain it in the ways I think you would understand. They wanted to have a flat rate across the entire city. So they set a rate of $3,750 for residential across the entire city. Now they have 17 service areas. So there were a few service areas that was above their maximum. So they just set it at the maximum rate. But in general for residential, they set it at $3,750 across the entire city. And then the other residential categories were the ratio that you've seen before. They kind of just, multifamily being that 40% of single family. So they set it kind of at a dollar amount across the entire city. For non-residential, they did a 25% discount. So if you heard what I just said in Midland, Fort did the opposite. They set their residential rate. They didn't use a percentage. They used a flat fee of $3,750. And then they took the equivalent $3,750 for residential, equated that to non-residential, and gave them a 25% discount. So that's how they set their rates in Fort Worth. Fort Worth did have some discounts or reduction technical in there, including the ordinance. And one of our folks from the last meeting from the Home Builders Association referenced actually Fort Worth discounts. One of the discounts they provided was if you build on a roadway that's already built out, if it's they call it the adequate facilities discount. If it's already built out, they gave a 50% discount. So this was, just to be clear, the rate is calculated separately. So the rate was at $3,750 for residential, and then the 25% discount for non-residential. After that's calculated, these are other discounts that you could apply for. One being adequate facilities, meaning if you are connecting to a road that's already built out, you get an additional 50% discount. Another one was the mixed use eternal capture discount. So if you were to build a development that had a mix of usage, you could do a worksheet that's ITE, and you can either get a 5, 10, or 15% discount depending on how much internal capture you have. The idea behind that is if you build a multi-use building with restaurants on the bottom, apartments on the top, that not everyone's driving and there's trips that are walking back and forth. So they allow this discount of up to 15%, but they either give you a 5, 10, or 15% discount. And then the last discount was called the extraordinary investment discount. This is the discount, and I'm going to paraphrase the discount a little bit, but it was really an incentive that the Economic Development Department had to attract there was job requirements and infrastructure requirements put into that discount. So they had like an economic incentive. If you met this many jobs and this much infrastructure, you got this discount. And that discount could be up to 50%.
What was that discount called?
Extraordinary investment.
And what was the discount percentage you were saying at the end?
50%. I believe. It varies based on their investment. Let me double check that, but I'll get back on that one. But I didn't write that one down because it varies depending on the investment. But my understanding of Fort Worth, like the extraordinary investment has been used for like Bell Helicopter headquarters and American Airlines headquarters. But those are kind of like that. It's a pretty big dollar when you actually look at the requirements to meet it. So the other thing that they did in Fort Worth that may be advantageous is if they kept the 1 year grace period, but as we've talked in council, like we said, you set a rate. they could set a rate, whenever they set the rate, and it could be X. Fort Worth wanted to make sure that there was a grace period whenever the rate changed. So whenever the rate changes, there is a 1-year grace period as well. So, which is not required by law, because if you change the rate, you've already gone through the grace period, you can go. But they just said if you go from, so Fort Worth recently went from $3,000 a house to $3,750 that I talked about. So they had a year, if you were already platted, that you were stuck at the $3,000 a house before you went to the $3,750. So they gave a grace period whenever the rates changed. So that's not required. That's just one of their extra things that they had in their ordinance. And that's it for really the policy discussions on Fort Worth. Any questions on Fort Worth?
I have a question about the 3,000 a house to 3,750 a house. How long did it take them to, from, I guess 3,000 a house was their initial implementation of impact fees, and what year was that? And then in what year did they increase to 3,750?
Sure. So the history of Fort Worth has had impact fees since 2008. So in 2008, they adopted $2,000 a house. And you can also imagine 2008 was a different economic time too. Maybe not so much from now, but at that time it was right during the recession. So they adopted $2,000 a house. In 2013, they updated the study, and that's when they did $3,000 a house. And in 2018, they did their other 5-year update, and that's when they went to $3,750.
And when you speak of a grace period, when they make that increase, I think Thomas had mentioned last night that there can always be increases or decreases or adjustments. I don't assume that they've had a decrease in any rates based on what you just said, but if there was a decrease in rates, how does that, do they define the grace period? You wouldn't really need a grace period if you're decreasing rates. Is that correct?
It's not defined the ordinance, but I don't know how they would handle that. They haven't had a decrease. That's an interesting question. I would imagine that if a decrease happened, that they would probably give the benefit to that, but I don't know because it hasn't happened in that city. But if you were to give a decrease in the rate, you would have to amend the ordinance anyway. So if that question came up, they could amend that line in the ordinance to clarify that. Any other questions on Fort Worth? I'm actually going to skip on my list to Denton because I realized just having that conversation, the question Annie just asked, and it might be helpful. So Denton adopted about 5 years ago, and they adopted $2,000 a house. And so the reason I brought that up is because if you heard, that's where Fort Worth had just adopted $3,000 a house, and basically Denton's decision was that they matched the old Fort Worth rates when they started. That was just their advisory committee said, hey, we like what Fort Worth did, let's match that. So the reason I'm bringing up Denton because it ties into Fort Worth, they pretty much mirrored Fort Worth rates from their original study in 2008, but they adopted around 2014-13 timeframe. And so it was $2,000 a house. They had that same 25% discount for non-residential. The one thing that they did interesting is that was really important to Denton at the time. The only reduction they really had outside of the rate structure, they didn't have the same discounts I mentioned for Fort Worth. They had a discount. They wanted, industrial was really important to the city. So they capped the dollar for industrial. That's the easiest way to say it, is they had a special discount just for industrial. That was the only other thing that was consideration. It was really hot and heavy on their mind. They had a lot of development, industrial development happening around the airport. And so they wanted to make sure they captured industrial. It was a discount for industrial. They capped it.
Would it be helpful, or maybe it would be to me, on Midland, Fort Worth, and Denton, when you're talking about dollar amounts, I guess just in general, can you add the note of sewer, water, roadway? Did all those cities implement impact fees for all three of those?
Yeah, and I should have clarified. I haven't did research. I plan to do the research on the water and waste, so I've only done research on the roadway right now. So everything I'm speaking is on the roadway. We'll have to bring back the water and wastewater on these cities. Unless Andrew has any research on these, he wants to chime in. Most cities, so Midland was done together. So what I said for Midland applies to water and wastewater. Fort Worth is actually completely separate processes and separate documents, separate departments. They're completely separate. Denton's the same way, completely different, separate departments, separate divisions. So Midland was just like Lubbock; they handled them together. Fort Worth and Denton handled them separately.
Jeff, I have a question about that. When you say they handled them separately, you mean that Denton, upon their initial adoption of impact fees, did not include water and wastewater on the list of things on which fees could be charged, so they had to completely redo that process?
The opposite. They've had water and wastewater for a long time. They left off roadway, and when they did roadway in 2014, I believe, they had to do the whole process for the roadway. It was the opposite.
Gotcha.
I think Fort Worth.
So my question, it doesn't really change my question. When they came back and redid to include roadways, how long did that process take? Approximately.
About the same process we've been through. I think we adopted about 13 months and didn't.
So it truly is a redo of the entire process.
Yes, we made the decision in both Fort Worth and Denton to follow the full process because they didn't have roadway impact fees. And we didn't think it was fair to consider an update, even though they had water and wastewater, but it was a brand new thing. So we followed the full process.
Did you mention what the dollar rate was in Midland?
The what?
The dollar amount? You were talking about 2000 and Denton, you know, is where it started. Where did Midland start?
I did that for Denton and Fort Worth. They set their rate based on $1. Midland set it based on a percentage. So there's 4 service areas in Midland. They're all different.
That's it.
And I'm pulling up their rate schedule right now. I have it. I didn't have it on my cheat sheet for y'all, but I can tell you what those are if you give me a few minutes.
Also, while you're looking at that, there's 4 service areas in Midland. How large are those in trip length?
Basically the 6-mile trip length that's comparable to Lubbock.
So that just visually, it took 4 6-mile trip lengths to 4 service areas to cover the size of Midland, and it takes 8 for Lubbock. Just that's the difference in vehicle mile trip size of the 2 cities.
I should say there's actually, not to confuse anyone, there's 5 service areas in Midland, but one of them's the airport, and there was a decision not to do anything in the airport. Like, I guess you could call that a policy decision, but because the way, if you've been to Midland, you know, the airport is still technically part of Midland. So that was a 5th service area, but we did not do impact fees in that 5th service area. So for Midland, the impact fee ranges from $17.39 per house. I'm sorry, $15.70 in one service area, $17.39 in another, $2,200 in another, and then $2,285 in another. So between $1,500 and $2,300 is the range in Midland.
Just for roadway.
Just for roadway. And I do have the water and wastewater if y'all want to hear for a 1-inch meter. And in Midland, for water impact fee, it was $12.42. And for wastewater, it was $6.28. Or it is $6.28. And just to let you know, Midland, if you Google Midland impact fees, they have a website and they have the estimator worksheet that will be probably very similar to what you would see in Lubbock, and you can pull it up and you can kind of look at it and play with whatever land usage you want. So Midland's website actually has that. Any other questions on those three? I have two more that I've kind of researched for this call, only on the roadway side, but kind of was waiting to see how last night went before I did too much research on it. But
So real quick on Midland, if you gave us anywhere from 1570 a house to 2285 a house for roadway, and that is after you do a 25% discount off the cut it in half discount.
correct. That's their actual rate that they're assessing right now. The other example I had, which I've mentioned several times in here, and I do have water, wastewater, and roadway for this one, and it's the College Station example. And they don't have anything special beyond state law in there. So all their discussion was about the rate, but their rate was all dollar amount. Their rate was, as I mentioned before, they decided to charge, $5,000 for a single family house. And that was broken up with they had a large need for wastewater facilities, and their wastewater needs are large. So it's $3,000 for wastewater, $500 for water, and then $1,500 for roadway. The only unique thing that College Station did do, they did do a phase-in period. So it didn't start out at that, they phased it in over time. That was one thing that they didn't do a grace period, they didn't extend the grace period, but they did do a little phase-in period where it didn't start. It started at basically a third, then went to 2/3 of that amount, then went to the full amount that I just mentioned.
Over what period of time, Jeff?
Looks like each phase was a year. So over, yeah.
They took 2 years from inception to get to the full amount of 5,000.
Right. And just to note, much like the discussion on Fort Worth and Denton, Fort Worth and Denton's process was completely separate. They already had water and wastewater, different department, different timing, different schedule, and we did roadway completely separate. 2 different committees, never mixed the two together. College Station already had water and wastewater, but when they put it together, we actually did them together. So even though they already had, it was an update to water and wastewater, they made the decision to run all 3 together. It was an update to water and wastewater, but it was a new roadway impact fee, but we just did them together and followed the same process. It made a lot of sense because they were going on at the same time. Why have 2 committees? Let's put them together. So College Station ran them together, but they've had water and wastewater for some time.
So Jeff, I have a question. Are you saying they created a second SEAC committee for roadways in that example? Completely separate SEAC committee?
In most cases, it was the same. So in Fort well, I don't know, Andrew might want to chime in on Fort Worth. I think he's on. I think Fort Worth has its own CIC committee for Fort Worth.
That's
for
correct.
water.
Yes.
So it is in Fort Worth, it's different committees because in Fort Worth for roadway, we use planning commission. And y'all don't use planning commission for water and wastewater, correct?
That's right. Yeah, there's one group that is composed of wholesale customers because Fort Worth passes their impact fees on to wholesale customers. And there's another group which there's a capital improvements advisory committee separate from that group as well.
Fort Worth, it's 2 different bodies, but all the other cities, like Denton, even though it was a different time in Denton, they used P&Z, so technically it was the same body. It was just different times. But in Fort Worth, it's completely separate bodies too.
Thank you.
Going back to College Station, I missed the $5,000 a house, 3,000 was for wastewater. What was the rest of that?
15 for roadway, 500 for water. Now, Andrew, you may want to chime in a little bit more on water and wastewater. There's a few nuances to water and wastewater in College Station. I don't know if you know, Andrew, there's some special areas in water and wastewater that have some extreme needs that they treat a little differently. But generally speaking, citywide, that's their fee. There's some special areas in College Station and how they treat water and wastewater. I don't know if you know anything about that, Andrew, off the top of your head or not, but
No, I wasn't part of that study, so I couldn't speak to the details on College Station.
But holistically, most of the cases of what I just told you, there's, when you try to get infrastructure built for some undeveloped areas, there's some special things that have to happen sometimes, because to get a sewer line out there, you might have to do some special things. So there's some special areas, mainly I think related to sewer and College Station. So if you do some research and go to the College Station website, you'll find a lot on water and wastewater. You won't find as much on roadway and College Station, but you'll find a lot on water and wastewater and College Station. The next city I had was New Braunfels, which, much like Fort Worth and Denton, water and wastewater are handled separately. Actually, the New Braunfels Utility Organization District, whatever it's called, handles the water and wastewater, and the city handles the roadway. So they're kind of different departments, separated. They both use P&Z as their advisory committee, so they're presenting to the same people but different times. They've had impact fees for roadway since 2008, and I have the comparison slides for all the cities I've been doing. Like, so from previous presentations, you can see the dollar amounts that you can go back to. But for years, and I kept New Braunfels for a while, because I wanted to tell the story of New Braunfels, of how things change. At the beginning of New Braunfels, on the roadway side, they decided to set a flat rate, much like I described in Fort Worth and Denton. They set a flat dollar rate per house. They continued that in 2013 for a flat dollar rate in a house. Then in 2019, when they adopted, the way they chose their rate is they really wanted to understand revenue projections. So really what the city of New Braunfels was trying to do on the roadway side, and I'll describe the water and wastewater side a little bit, what they were really trying to do on the, and I'm pulling up some numbers just so you have it. What they were trying to do was to project revenue. So what they did is they set a percentage of the maximum for each service area. So when you see New Braunfels, the question was asked in the workshop, if you watched the workshop, why is there two numbers for these cities? Like, why is there two numbers for New Braunfels? Why is there two numbers for Midlands? So I put the low and the high on the actual table. So New Braunfels set their percentage based on what they thought their revenue projection needed to be in the city, and they let the numbers fall out where they were. So they kind of said, this is the percentage we're going to charge across the city, and that's where they were. One of the things that they put in their requirements is the city had a goal that they wanted to charge. I think council and their advisory committee were a little bit nervous. So what they put in their resolution, if you will, is that we're going to set it at this rate, and then 1 year from now, this is our goal rate. So it wasn't a phase in, it wasn't automatic. Like I just mentioned in College Station, they went up. This was, hey, we want to be here, but let's test this other rate for a year. Because if you looked at New Braunfels, if you remember New Braunfels charts, it was on the far high end. On the water and wastewater, they adopted 50%. They adopted 50% on the water and wastewater. And if you recall from the presentation I gave you, that was a pretty hefty number. And on roadway, they adopted 35% for residential. Sorry, my slide just stopped working, or my notes just won't open up. They adopted a percentage for residential with a discount for non-residential, and I'll tell you what that percentage is in a minute once my spreadsheet opens up. But the decision in New Braunfels was, the important thing is they based on revenue projections. They say, how much revenue do we need? So they targeted our revenue projections, and then they basically worked those percentages in to kind of equate to that revenue projection that they felt was needed. My computer is completely froze at this point right now, except for Zoom. I don't know why. But that was the last city I had. I can answer any question on New Braunfels and bring you back in what those percentages actually were.
So tell us again about the residential versus non-residential discount there, Jeff.
They adopted a lower percentage for non-residential than they did for residential.
A lower percentage meaning less discount?
So that's a good question. So like, and I'm looking up what those percentages were, so don't quote me on this so I get it. But like for residential, they charge 40%, and for non-residential, they charge 20%. But I'll tell you what that actually was. So unlike Fort Worth, where they adopted residential, hey, we're going to give a discount. New Braunfels just said, hey, we're charging X% for residential, X% for non-residential. But it was lower, so it was, if you will, it's a discount. That was the only other thing that is in New Braunfels that they have is they have an affordable housing thing specifically called out in their ordinance, but it really references the state statute of affordable housing. So it's not workforce housing, which a lot of us think of as affordable housing, like the median income workforce housing. This was true federally mandated affordable housing that you meet federal requirements. They had a specific language in the ordinance that says if you meet affordable housing as mandated by, the federal government, you don't pay an impact fee. That's the only thing that's maybe special in New Braunfels that's a little different outside of the way they set their rates.
Jeff, I apologize, but I want to be sure I understand the 40% for residential and 20% for non-residential. Is that 40% of the maximum or 40% discount from the maximum?
Of the maximum.
Okay, thank you.
And I'm working on verifying those percentages, but it's not a discount, that's of. So I tried to avoid the cities that did that credit calculation. So New Braunfels did the full credit calculation, so they didn't cut it in half. So it's 40% of their maximum. So it's a little deceiving because they didn't cut it in half. So, but they charge 40%. And the numbers that I showed you on the presentation on May 8th are the numbers for New Braunfels. And now my computer's starting to work, so I can answer.
And just to be clear in the record, when they did the credit calculation, did that yield a higher or a lower maximum impact fee calculation?
A higher.
Thank you.
%50 tends to be a conservative number for a city of a larger population. There's if you have a large population, the 50%, like a Lubbock of 250,000 people, the 50% tends to be a little bit larger than if you do the full actual calculation.
I know you had said that back very early in our life as a committee. I just wanted to let you get that in the record again.
I'm trying to put together a takeaway on one kind of concept out of these 5 examples, and tell me if I'm right. So we have the 50% or the cut in half off the max calculation. New Braunfels is the only one that does it differently from these 5 examples.
Actually, Fort Worth, all of them, actually Fort Worth and Denton did the full calculation, but the way they set the rate wasn't on a percentage, so it didn't actually matter because they set it at a dollar amount. So that's why I didn't confuse you, but they did the same calculation as New Braunfels. So, but they set it on $37.50 a house as opposed to a percentage, so it didn't really matter as much. You could know the dollar amount.
I think what I'm trying to get to is out of these examples, I think you said New Braunfels did a 50%. They adopted the cut in half or the 50% on water and wastewater.
Yes, correct.
Which in our case, the way where we're at right now would be like saying we're going to adopt a max fee for water and wastewater. And outside of that example, I know a lot of them are set on flat dollar amounts, but if you compare flat dollar amounts to the percentage, is that the only water, wastewater, or roadway in any of these 5 cities that was adopted at max level?
I'm going to kick it over to Andrew on the water and wastewater. I will say this anecdotally before Andrew speaks in. Most of the cities I work with on the water and wastewater side, it's typically adopted at the max. Unless there's some discount to residential or non-residential, they'll adopt it at the max, and they might give a discount to residential or non. I'll kick it over to Andrew just on water and wastewater to kind of chime in on his. If you want to speak anecdotally.
Yeah, sure. Echoing what Jeff said, a lot of the communities, especially like in the DFW area, they tend to just be right around what that max allowable rate is. I'm trying to think of Fort Worth. I know they did the full blown credit financial calculations and came at a number that they could have charged well over 50%. And I'm trying to pull that information up right now. I'd like to be able to give that to y'all, but I think that it tends. I do have an example of last year. Worked with the city around DFW that put in a new impact fee program, and they set their water wastewater at the max 50%. Their roadways, they decided to do instead of the 50%, they took another 25% off that. So they cut that max number in half on the roadway side. So every city does it a little differently. It's just kind of what kind of works best for their case.
I guess I'm just trying to say is it unanimous that every city is doing some form or fashion of discounts, or is it, is that, am I never going to be able to make that?
I think the point on, I was trying to say, I think what Andrew's saying is you don't see it as common on the water and wastewater side. A lot of cities adopt their maximum. And if there is anything that's considered, it's usually like, if you're treating residential like Midland did, like residential gets that 25% discount. That's usually what we see on water and wastewater side, just because when you look at the numbers, it's very common. On the roadway side, I would say it's uncommon to be the maximum. There's usually some sort of discount either applied to something or a flat rate. So that's what I was trying to group them. If you're taking a summary away, you want to do it on the water and wastewater side. If you look at, Lubbock in specific, or what we currently calculated based on the assumptions we have right now, the 500, the numbers usually end up being a little bit smaller than the roadway. So a lot of times the dollar is not discounted when it's adopted. So the maximum's more commonly taken on the water and wastewater side. On the roadway side, there's a discount typically, or some kind of rate reduction.
Yeah, if I want to make the point that, I think it's important for us to look at these examples, but particularly in regard to your last comment, I think it's critically important to bear in mind that each city that sets off on this path begins at a different place. As we discussed very early on, Lubbock is in more serious need of addressing roadway construction than water and sewer construction. But clearly many of these other cities began at just the opposite place, where their desperate need was more about water and or wastewater. And so they started out in some cases with only water and wastewater impact fees. And so I think as we dig into our policy discussion, it's important for us to bear in mind that it's good to use these things to inform us, but Lubbock is in a different situation for a lot of reasons in regard to various of these things than the other cities were. There's no direct apple-to-apple comparison, right?
Yeah, absolutely. The reason I pulled the College Station example is because they had a big need for wastewater. And that's why their wastewater number was there. Every city's at a different location. I did pull the New Braunfels numbers just so I can get quoted correctly. They adopted in year one 50% of the maximum for residential, 25% for non-residential. I knew it was a 2-to-1 ratio. I couldn't remember what it was. It's 50% and 25% as opposed to the 40 to 20 I said.
Okay, thank you. Does anyone have any questions for Jeff at this point? Jeff, I have one I want to set the table for a discussion we'll get into later. You had mentioned to me that in regard to the issue of discounts, once you get into these different categories, that generally that discussion is divided into, I believe you said 5 general categories. Could you just state those categories for us?
Yes. Typically, we work through cities if we're talking about specific discounts to different things. Typically, we start with residential versus non-residential, those 2 big categories. If we break it down to a next category, and this was kind of the discussion we had in Denton, if you recall, we have residential can be broken down to typically like single family versus multifamily. And then we have On the commercial side, we sometimes break it down to industrial, office, and then retail. And if you recall, that's kind of how we do the land use assumptions too. Those are the 5 grading categories. So usually when we talk about discounts, we kind of, most of the time, most cities, probably 90% of the cities I work in, they stick with the residential versus non-residential. There's a few cities that get a little bit more into the details and go multifamily, single family, industrial, office, and then commercial. They'll get a little bit more fine tuned on it.
And you're using the words commercial and non-residential to mean the same thing, correct?
All right, let me rephrase so we call it basic, service, and retail. And that's what's in the thing. Basic is kind of industrial, service is office, retail, I was calling it commercial, but anything that sells goods or food or et cetera is kind of what I'm lumping into that commercial or retail category.
So those 5 would be single family, multifamily, basic, service, and retail.
Correct.
Okay. All right. So it's 10:47. I'm going to plan a break at somewhere around 11 o'clock. I want to move into a discussion about the city council meeting last night. And I want to start by asking Mr. Keenum to give us a sort of an after summary in terms of his perception of what happened last night, what was discussed, and where we are. But then I want us all to have a chance to give our own opinions of what happened last night. Mr. Keenum?
Thank you, Thomas. And so obviously we know that no decisions were made last night, one way or the other, that those of y'all that were in attendance were there. And so I know at least Katie was watching online. I don't know if Larry had a chance to watch online or not, but basically last night they decided not to decide anything last night. And so they have left the public hearing open and continued the public hearing to the date of June 23rd to continue the conversation. And so what that does is it just keeps us on the same path as far as all the postings of everything are still valid. So we didn't stop and then have to restart with the 30-day posting and all of that. And so if there's adjustments that they want to make to the report, we can still do those things. Again, we did not get any direction from them specifically to change anything at this point. You know, they had some questions about the growth rate is the 2.5%, what we need to stick with or not. And so that will remain to be seen if we stick there. They wanted some more information on that. And then, you're kind of going through the rest of it. There wasn't really a direction other than to come back with some more information. So we're going to be working on that. I did get word just a little bit ago. This is kind of for everybody, but especially for Jeff and Andrew, is that they do want to have a work session on June 9th, to add that to the council meeting on June 9th, to have more discussion and Q&A with council on some of the things that came up last night. I don't know a time of that yet. If it follows standard, it would be probably around 1-ish. I don't know that. As we get that information, we'll get that out to you, but they have requested that there is a work session on June 9th prior to that June 23rd date to continue the public hearing. So the June 9th would not be the public hearing because they did officially set the continuation of it as June 23rd. And so there won't be the public hearing piece between now and June 23rd. And so understanding this is the continuation, this would not be the second public hearing where we're talking about policy. We're still only talking about the land use assumptions and the service areas. We have not moved beyond that. However, council and the city manager want us as a group and as a committee to continue to move forward and work towards that end goal as you continue to start having the policy discussions with this committee. Obviously, we can't refine those, like Andy said earlier, until we get that official direction from council on this phase 1. But they expect for this group to continue to move on to phase 2 and to have the discussions that you're having and will continue to have. And so we're not on pause as a committee. That process and the public format process is kind of on a hold, if you will, for until June 23rd. But then we'll get back and at that point, they kind of have the options open to them again, is that they could continue to leave the public hearing open I have a feeling that they will probably close it at that point, but they don't have to take action on June 23rd. They still have after the close of the public hearing, state law says they have to take action within 30 days, either to approve or disapprove. And so once that public hearing closes, that starts the clock. The clock is not ticking for them yet because the public hearing is still open. And so they've given them some flexibility to collect some more information and learn more so that they can make an educated decision as well.
Tim, thank you. I think I'll just recognize everyone one at a time and give everyone a chance to talk about their perception of the meeting last night. In no particular order, I'm going to recognize Mr. Bean first.
Thank you. Takeaways was it was very well attended. Lots of good comments from public. I think there was Jordan Wheatley spoke on behalf of, I think he quoted 4,500 members of 4 different associations, and that kind of sped things up for him to summarize their stance, which we've, I think, generally seen in a lot of their letters to us. But just to be short on my end, I would like to ask that, and it's good to hear they're going to have planning a work session on the 9th prior to the 23rd. And I'd like to ask by that work session to provide clarity for the council and in efforts to move them to a vote, to get the consultant and the city staff to provide the following, which would be a model to actually model our report and max fee calculations based on a 2% growth rate, because that's where there was a lot of time and energy spent on that with not many answers last night on the effect of a 2% versus a 2.5%. There's a numerator and a denominator, and some projects would fall off. And what's that do to the max fee calculation? So let's give them that information and show the actual effect. And then secondly, everyone seemed to be in agreement that the enterprise fund LP&L rates are currently keeping up with sewer and water. So I would like to see us use the list of projects on our current sewer and water capacity plan in our current report that's before the council, use that list of projects and model out what LP&L rates would do or have to do over the next 10 years at a 2.5% growth rate. And then what about a 2% growth rate? So you take out some projects and model out what the LP&L rates would do over the next 10 years. I think that's going to be an impactful, that's going to be impactful information for the council to get the clarity they need to take action or cast their votes. And then I think that's all I wanted to say at this point. So I'll
just to clarify, Andy, that
there is one thing that I want to point out about what Andy said. The council is always has the right to ask for whatever information they want to. So nothing we do limits their ability to ask the consultants for information. On the other hand, long ago in our process, we took a vote and adopted the 2.5% growth rate. So I think for us now as a committee to go back and revisit the question of growth rate, which is part of the report we've already submitted to council for approval, I think at the very least it would require a motion to reopen that part of the discussion, if we can even do that. And I'm not sure. Kelly, do you want to weigh in on that?
Sure. You can open a motion or seek a motion in order to consider revising or looking at that growth rate. Also, I would suggest or say that just to consider it, you wouldn't necessarily need a motion, but as the chair, you would probably look for a majority interest from your committee. And then any recommendation based on that review would definitely need a motion.
Okay, so I'm going to do exactly that. I want to open a discussion about that subject to see if the committee wants to go back and revisit that issue at the committee level. Does anyone have any comments about that?
My comment would be the CPAC recommended a 2.5%. I guess 2.5 or 2 months after we started this in the middle of our education, we approved a 2.5%. I think generally we did that just based off of the CPAC's recommendation and trusting their work. I don't think my recommendation is for us to change our report, but there's pretty much 3 things the council's trying to agree on or take a vote on, and that's growth rate projections, including sewer, water, and roadway or not. And then the last one, what am I missing? There's one more thing.
Service areas?
Yes, service areas. So they were obviously not getting the information they needed to the extent that the report gives with a 2.5% growth rate compared to 2%. So I think without doing anything different on our committee, that the consultant and the city staff could just provide information on June 9th at the work session, unless that has to be done through us, that would show what it would look like taking the growth rate down.
I did talk to one of the councilmen after the meeting last night to ask what exactly he wanted in regards to variability of growth rate percentages. And he said, I'm not sure yet. I'll get back with you. And so, we just need to understand too, is that, as we're pushing and pulling the consultants to do a lot of number crunching now and backing up and redoing some of that, that's a lot of effort on their part. We can get some numbers, and even trying to do the full LP&L projection 10 years out. That's part of what is going to happen. I don't know if we can get that in a week's time or not. I agree with you, Andy, that we need to get some information to council so they can be more comfortable with this, and trying to work through what exactly they want is going to be the challenge going forward.
But I'll say one more thing. To get out of phase 1, my takeaways from last night is we need to provide what it looks like at 2% with more comparison, apples to apples versus 2.5, which is where all the work's been done and the numbers that they've seen and that we've seen. And then what does it look like if you take sewer and water completely out of this at this point? And we all know that leaves one way to pay for sewer and water projects through the ratepayers. How does that actually look? And it's going to look different at a 2% growth rate versus 2.5%. So show them both of those. And that's what I feel like would help the council get past phase 1.
So Andy, I'll say a couple of things. One, I don't disagree with anything you're saying. I want to be clear. I think that, we're now in a policy discussion phase. The council is in the phase of addressing the report that we submitted to them. I really think it's the council's place to request this information from the consultants rather than ours at this point. And I'm certain that they're going to request some kind of similar information, be it a 2% growth rate or 2.25 or what. I'm sure they're going to request something along these lines. And so all I'm saying is I think we may want to leave it to them to make that request specifically to the consultants rather than us asking for a 2% projection and then the council coming in and asking the consultants for another projection on a different percentage. Does that make sense?
Sure. And I did not talk to any council or the mayor since the end of the meeting last night. I'm just anticipating this is going to be asked or something similar. That's the takeaway I got out of it, to get them off high center, to make them feel, those that weren't confident or prepared to vote on it last night. I think my takeaway is this is the information, the 2 top items they need, and I anticipate they will request it. So to avoid further delay, I'm asking, and maybe it's not my place to ask us what you're saying, and I'm fine with that, but I'm asking the staff and the consultant to either prepare for that request or go ahead and start working on it. And that's what think is going to happen.
So, I mean, it is my perception that really, just as you said, it's my perception it's not our place to ask them to do this. But I'm happy for us all to discuss it. And if somebody wants to make a motion, I'll entertain one. I just think that the council is going to request from the consultants undoubtedly information for that June 9 work session. And so I'm not sure that, you know, if we make a request of the consultants, I think we want to be careful about not having them start down one path and then 3 days from now, the council turns them to a different place and they're spending their time on things that, you know, that aren't actually going to happen. I don't know if that makes sense. I'm happy to entertain any other comments.
That's all I have for now.
I mean, again, I agree with your point. I want to be clear. I'm not disagreeing with what you're saying needs to happen. I just think it's going to happen without us being involved in the process that's now in the council's hands. I'll say it that way. So I'll move to Mr. Sawyer. Comments about last night.
I don't have a whole lot more to add. I mean, Andy hit pretty good on attendance and things like that. Some of the thing, or just kind of one thing that kind of stuck out to me was, and it was just a point of numbers in our report. And when there were kind of discussion about the water towers and stuff like that, and Mr. Griffith mentioned that those water towers pretty much paid for themselves, but we also have those in our report as part of our capital improvements. Maybe Mike, you can address that just a little bit more, but it seems if they pay for themselves, then why are we adding that into our report? That was just one thing that I took away from that, which when I went back, I came back and looked at it, that makes up 25% of the water plan on those water towers.
Well, I think as you look at, so the first one that's on the list, for instance, you know, it's listed as like 4.8 million, and the recoverable cost piece of that is less than $1 million, and then that gets cut in half. And so for your roughly $5 million project, $500,000 of that is what's going into the recoverable cost to get to that max fee for the water. And so just understanding that as you break down those numbers, and as we do these elevated tank projects, we've been telling council all along, when all of them are built, the energy savings we get from electricity savings from pumping is that there's been some models that once they're all built, the electricity savings will pay on the operation and maintenance side, will pay for them over like a 7-year period for each tank. So when you get all 5, that's still 35 years. So understanding that all 5 of them have to be built and in place before you start seeing those savings and realizing that. So just understanding that is how it is, but it still costs a capital cost up front to build those before we'll ever start seeing that impact. And so they're sized for growth. They're sized for partially for the needs that we have today. So at 50th Street, we just tore down one and we're going to start construction on a new one in its place. It's going to be bigger than what the previous one was to not just meet the connections that we have today, but also the future connections that will be added. So there is that growth component that's there. That's why it's on the list, because it's not built, it's not in service today. And so, you know, is it in the current budget? Yes. Is it operational and on the ground? No. And so that's why it's on the future projects list, even though it's, because we don't know if impact fees are going to happen or not, right? There's projects that we have to do and continue moving. And so we use the rates that we have, the tax rates and the water and sewer rates to pay for the projects that we have to build today. And so that's just, again, like you said, Andy, you know, the only tool we have right now for water and sewer projects is the rates. And so this would provide another one to stretch some of those maintenance dollars farther if they choose to adopt that. If not, then we try to figure out how to build what we need to with the rates, or we slow down the building of the water and sewer infrastructure if it increases the rates too high. So that's an important piece that we need to know that we don't have the answer to yet. That is part of what I've talked to Jeff and Andrew both that we need to see what those rate impacts will be to build these projects. And because I think that's part of the picture. Instead of just saying, no, we don't need them now, let's see what the rates would be. If the rate increase is not significant, then maybe we don't need water and sewer today. I don't know that we know enough to make that call right now. I don't know if that helps answer your question or not, Shane.
Yeah, I don't know. I still try to wrap my head around it too. It's coming with that philosophy of, I know we can put dollars in there. We have the right to put them in there, and we put it out there to give us flexibility. But that also gives the ability to raise rates higher than maybe they should be. So it's just the balance of, do we include it? Is it really needed? And I hear where you're coming from as well. But when you're looking from the other side of who's having to pay it, and it's almost like a subsidy, I see it as. But so it's just a conceptual, is it right or is it wrong? I don't know the answer either, but it just stuck out to me last night. And
Sure.
Thank you. That's all I really had.
All right. We're going to take a 5-minute break at this point. We'll come back and let everybody else have a chance to talk. We're still missing a few. There they come. Mr. Sawyer. All right, do we have everyone back? Don't see Irene.
She's there.
Oh, great. Okay, great. I'll call us. Hi, Irene. I'll call us back into session now. And I'll go to Ms. Cantu Franks for your comments about the meeting last night.
I'm sorry. Well, hi guys. I was at the meeting last night and I was kind of like, okay, we were given a task and I think we have all worked very diligently to get what they wanted laced down for the beginning phase. I was kind of floored at the point that they wanted to hold off on a decision. And again, I really don't understand why the council feels they didn't have the information that we've had all this time. And that's one of my biggest issues, you know, is that if we've had this information this whole time and we've had access to the consultants, to the engineering department, why haven't they had access to them? Or why are they needing these answers now? But and going forward, I'm kind of stunned. Are we supposed to proceed in working on something that we're not even sure it's going to take place? Or what do we do? I mean, I'm kind of stunned. What is our task today? And I know that, you know, Mike said we got to continue, and I understand we need to continue, but we're throwing rocks at the same thing over and over and over. At some point, we've got to have a direction.
So I'll make a comment to that, Irene, and I appreciate your comments. I agree with you about a lot of that. I believe our job is to push forward. We're in the policy phase of this process. The city council is not. They're still in the beginning phase of this, and I think that's one important thing to bear in mind. So they'll muddle through the beginning phase in whatever fashion they choose to. But I believe our job is to push forward, and as far as I'm concerned, complete our job to the extent that we can, understanding that if on June 23rd, the council does something that takes part of our job off the table, I'd rather have it done and they can lop it off if they want to than to sit around and wait for them on the 23rd. I believe the council is more or less going to adopt the report that we sent them. But that's purely my own personal speculation. It's not based on any knowledge at all or discussion with any of the council. Just my perception of what happened last night. Anything else?
No, that's all I have to say.
Mr. Bradley, were you able to watch the meeting last night, or have you?
Telling me no, I was out of pocket last night. So what I've read and what I've heard this morning is what I know from last night.
Okay, that's fine. I didn't know if you had been able to listen in or not. Ms. Salter.
Well, to agree with everyone else, even on TV, you could tell it was well attended. But and the videos are very cool. That was my first one to watch in the new city hall. So that was very neat, and good job for all of the technology people on that, because I know that's kind of difficult. But I definitely thought it was a good meeting. I too thought we would have some direction from the council, Irene, just thinking, you know, we've been kind of, trying to figure out where they would go or what would change and all of that. I understand we're continuing with the process and that's fine, but I too thought we would have some direction. So today I was like, well, what are we going to do? But of course we have lots to do and lots of very in-depth conversations to happen. And of course the meat of this thing is really the second phase, in my opinion. I do think, and I think this was mentioned, but I think it might be helpful to see, even maybe for us as we go into the next policy phase, to see what that tax rate has to be to do all of our projects. If there was no money elsewhere to do that, you know, just what the effective rate would, well, maybe I shouldn't say effective, but what the tax rate would have to be changed to in order to do our list of for water and wastewater. But I thought that might be helpful for us and even council if they requested it, or, I know they'll request what they want, but.
Katie, are you, do you mean tax rate? Or are you also including a look at the wastewater and water rates if we didn't have impact fees on those?
Actually, yes, you're right. Thanks for the clarification. Yes, because that's a different thing. So really both.
Okay. So Mike or Jeff, I know you said these are numbers that we're going to have that will be calculated. At what point do you think we'll have those numbers?
I'll defer to Jeff a little bit, but we were talking to the rate guy a little bit yesterday to try to spitball some numbers, and he's got some work to do to try to figure out before we're comfortable throwing anything in public. We just kind of go, well, maybe this. I don't know that we wanted to say that, but to actually get down and look at the numbers and get you a real answer that's in the ballpark is going to take him some time. Jeff, do you have an idea of what it would take Chris to do that? You're on mute too, Jeff.
I think we would have to make some assumptions, like some of it's going to depend on because we don't know what the recommendation of the committee is. A lot of times we do that calculation when we know what the revenue projections are going to be. So if right now all we know is the maximum, so we would have to give him hey, can you figure out what that rate is on the water bill with what is in the study at the maximum recoverable rate? So we could do that now, given the assumption it'd probably take him a week or two to get that information back to us. But we would be making an assumption on that we're going to collect this amount of money. And all we know right now is that in theory, we're collecting the maximum, the 50% number that we've seen before us. So unless you give us direction otherwise. So,
Jeff, I don't think that's the question that Ms. Salter was asking, unless I misunderstood. I understood that the ask is for the numbers of what the effect on the tax rate would be if we don't have impact fees at all for roadway, and the effect of the water and sewer rates if we don't have impact fees at all. So the maximum fee part wouldn't come into that.
Well, it would if we have to make an assumption of how much dollars we're collecting from impact fees.
Which is zero if we don't have them.
Right, so zero we would understand, so we could actually plug in the number and put everything into zero versus having them. So we can do that.
Katie, did I understand?
Zero versus that. Yeah.
Yes, on this, actually, I both would be very helpful. And of course, Jeff, I understand that the one you spoke of first really can't come till later, till we know what what dollar amount we're talking about in order to include the projects. But certainly at this point, yes, comparing it to a zero, what would it have to be? I think could be helpful, at least maybe solidify why we're down this path.
Jeff, do you have any kind of an estimated time frame in which you could complete that?
I think like I said, it usually takes us about a week or two to get that information back, so we can kind of coordinate on Monday with our partners and see. And I can get an estimation back to Mike, and he can let you know. But I would say probably 2 weeks is probably easy when we get that back from him. But that's what I would probably pencil in for right now. I may try to have that in the back pocket for June 9th just to have it, but that's kind of where my target would be. But that's about 2 weeks out. So
2 weeks would put us to not next Friday, but the following Friday, which would be the end of our ability to Zoom unless there's some further extension of that by the governor. All right. Mr. Hill, do you have any comments about last night's meeting? I know you were present.
Yes, sir. Thomas, can you hear me?
Yes,
Can
sir.
you guys hear me okay?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. Very good. I felt like the meeting was very informative. I tried to take, kind of extensive notes and pinpoint some of the high thoughts that all the speakers brought up. I also tried to kind of, I looked over my notes last night and found some strong correlations just in everybody's comments. So I think that will be helpful as we go into the policy phase. Just about the general consensus of the group that spoke. I also would have loved to have seen some direction, but I certainly understand the complexity of the information that we're dealing with. I went away thinking primarily that a lot of the concerns just were around the growth rate of 2.5%. I certainly understand why we landed on that 2.5%, but that's what I felt like most of the really a lot of points lead back to that growth rate. And so I know that's already been addressed earlier in this conversation. I know that Jeff and his team are going to work on that. So that was my comments, Thomas, is that I felt like really pinpointing that growth rate. I know Councilwoman Joy spoke about, what does it look like over the 10-year period, since we talked about the 2040 projections. I know she asked Heather that question. So I think, pinpointing what we think that might look like over the 10-year period that we're analyzing today would be helpful for the council as they make their decision. So that's my comments. I thought the meeting last night was very good and very helpful overall, though. So thank you, Thomas.
Mr. Hill, thank you. Jeff, I want to dig a little further into this question of growth rate, because we keep hearing about this issue from different sources who counts this as though it is a material thing, whether or not the growth rate assumption we use ultimately is 2.5% or 2%. You made the comment very early on, back when we addressed this and voted to adopt the 2.5% rate, that the difference would not be that great, because a reduction in the growth rate equals fewer projects. And I believe you said that not only could it not necessarily yield the big change, but it could actually cause the impact fee calculation to be higher if a lower growth rate was used than if a higher one was used. So I'd like to give you a chance to address that, and I want to make this comment first. The CPAC committee meetings were all public meetings, and they were all posted. There were all sorts of people involved, but there were members of the Home Builders Association, and as such, members of the Developers Council as well, who were on that committee. Particularly, specifically, I know Mr. Berry from Beacon Bow was on that CPAC committee, and I know that Dan Wilson was on that CPAC committee. I don't know of any others, but I know at least those were on the committee. I'm having a hard time understanding why anyone is needing to spend a lot of time on this issue. When the vote was taken by CPAC to adopt a 2.5% rate in their report to the council had every opportunity at that time to second guess that recommendation and change that rate. And they did not do so. And so I'm having a hard time understanding why that seems to be the focus that it is on the part of a lot of constituencies. But I'd like for you to talk to us more about really how important that is and how much difference that might make. Can you do that?
Sure, absolutely. And I'm going to tee Andrew up now just to let him know I'm going to turn it over to him, maybe to shed some light on the water and wastewater. I think, there's a lot of attention to it, just because I think that when you look at the numbers, it is a strong growth rate. And I think that was the intent of the CPAC committee. And using infrastructure planning, one of the big things that we look at is, what's the comp plan say versus what our infrastructure needs. And I mentioned this in the meeting last night, is if we were debating on, I'm just use number of homes instead of a growth rate, 100 homes versus 150 when we're doing an analysis and we're not sure, from infrastructure standpoint, we tend to look at 150 homes because we don't want to miss the shot. We got one shot to plan for this. So a lot of times when you ask me, hey, we have two growth rates, 2.5%, which one should we plan our infrastructure for? both seem reasonable. We're probably going to say 2.5%. And given the guiding light from the CPAC committee, that's one of the reasons we did that with y'all's voice. As far as your question about does it affect things, it's hard to know. There's a different procedure for water and wastewater, so that's why I'm going to have Andrew mention to the water and wastewater, because with the universal projects approach, we're looking at that percent, and it hits both the numerator and denominator. So as we go up, will it impact it? Yes, but I believe because of the process we use in roadway, because of our agreements use the universal project and the percentages, I believe it will have less of an impact to the water and to the roadway than it will for the water and wastewater. So I don't think that growth rate, you're going to see significant changes, because I think what you'll see is you'll see that beyond 10-year number get bigger and that 10-year number get a little bit smaller, but the denominator also gets smaller. So it's making the numerator and denominator a smaller denominator. Now, one caveat I will say is, we had to allocate that 2.5% growth rate across the city. So depending on how we actually decide to allocate it, if we allocate it at the exact same ratio across the whole city, I think the roadway is going to change very minimally, if that makes sense. So if we have to replace, and Andrew may be able to chime in on this, I think roughly 16,000 people, that's the difference between 2% and 2.5%. So we have to take out 16,000 people. And depending on which service area we take those out, if we take them out evenly, then I think the numbers are going to be very similar. If we decide to take all 16,000 out of one service area, that may have a big impact on that one service area. So that's why if we just said, hey, we're going to do a ratio in each service area, the numbers on roadway would probably end up being very similar. But depending on where we take those, so we have to make some of those decisions as we go. With Andrew, I've kind of teed you up on water and wastewater. I know it's a little bit different on water and wastewater because we use the project specific, so some projects might fall off. And I think to my comment earlier when I said we might see the fees go up, that could happen on water and wastewater if a project still stays on. But I'll let Andrew kind of describe maybe water and wastewater a little bit more.
Yeah, no, you're right, Jeff. The rough numbers have that 76,000 plus going down to right around 60,000. That's kind of the rough difference between 2.5% and 2% that we're looking at. And depending on how we make the decision to reallocate or cut out what that number is, what we do on the water wastewater side is we have hydraulic models that were built, and so you have to decrease the amount of water demands and wastewater flows based on that allocation. And so when you look at your 10-year model or your 2030 model, we're seeing less demand and less flow due to growth. So how does that impact those specific projects? And that's what we would be looking at to determine, how utilizes my project, how much utilization due to growth is occurring for my project. So how much of that total project cost is recoverable? Oh yeah, we do have to look at it specifically project by project, and know that where we're making this population change or decrease, how that's going to affect those specific projects. And that's that Jeff and I and Mike, we need to kind of have a starting point. I know one idea that we've started to talk about is looking at it from everybody just get an equal proportion cut out, see what the numbers look like then, determine does that make sense, or do we need to be a little bit more intentional about how the numbers get reallocated. But it is similar to the roadways in the aspect of if we're cutting out growth, we're going to be reducing our recoverable costs. So that's the numerator of our equation, but we're also going to be reducing our denominator as well, because we're taking out projected service units. So as your number of customers go down, your service units goes down. And so it is going to affect both ends of that equation. To what that extent is, I'm not sure yet.
Thomas, my observation is that we, today versus when CPAC was looking at growth rates, and today our committee versus the second month of our committee, there's just so much more engagement, and it's kind of a call to accuracy and sharpening your pencil when you have a chance and when it's, the vote's up to approve it or not. And so that's my observation of why it's come under a microscope. There's only really, like I mentioned earlier, 3 things the council's got up in front of them right now. So they want to make sure they're not, shooting themselves in the foot for any reason. So there's just that call to get things accurate. And it's, time's gone by since the CPAC, and that's been brought up of the current state we're in and what's the past 10-year history and what's, there's just been some things that have changed since the 2.5% came out of CPAC and a lot more engagement is my observation.
I think that's well said and good points, Andy. I do. Okay, I think we've been through everyone now. Other than myself, I have a few brief comments. I think it's great that we have the level of engagement that we have on the part of so many constituencies at this point. It's no longer limited to the home builders. It's been expanded now, and the Apartment Association and the Board of Realtors and Chamber of Commerce and commercial developers are all now engaged in the process, and many were represented last night, either directly or indirectly. And either way, many were in attendance in the audience. And I think that's great. We started out wanting exactly that. And we want to continue to encourage participation on the part of all of those parties and any others that we can get involved. I continue to say that education is the critical issue for everyone in this picture, including the committee and the city council. And I'll add to that, I think that there was a general perception that the city council is sort of coming along behind our committee in terms of level of understanding of some of the issues involved with impact fees. And I think that's only as should be expected. They appointed us to do a job, and if they were going to do that job at the same time, they wouldn't have any reason to appoint us. So I think that it makes sense that they're now where they are. I'm pleased that they have set this work session for June 9th. I anticipate that will lead into not just a closure of the public hearing, but action on their part on the 23rd. Again, that's based on my personal perception, and I have no knowledge from anyone that says that will be true, but it is my personal perception. I continue to believe that the issue of water and wastewater fees is one that I believe the council is going to continue to include water and wastewater on the list of things for which impact fees can be collected. And personally, I believe that they should. As I said in my comments last night, the issue of water and sewer rates is an issue that impacts our most economically challenged residents. And I think that all of us, including all of the constituencies that I mentioned earlier, we all need to not limit our area of concern to only the things that impact us directly. I think that we're all responsible to be concerned about all of the citizens of Lubbock. We don't need to have a lot of concern for the people who have built 3 and 4 and 5 and 6 and 20,000 square foot homes. They have the capacity to take care of themselves financially just fine. But the people who are at the other end of the scale, and I'm now talking about people who can't afford to buy the affordable housing, are the people who are most directly impacted by rates on water and sewer. And I just want to sort of reinforce the position that the staff has taken, which is that everyone acknowledges right now that water and sewer rates have gotten us to this point just fine. We're not upside down on those rates. The change in our growth rate and whatever you want to put in that blank for the number you want to use, I think everyone acknowledges our growth rate has changed. I haven't really heard anyone argue that we should be using a 1 or a 1.25% growth rate at this point. So everyone understands that growth rate has changed, and it is in that where the pitfall lies of not looking at the future with an eye toward that constituency of people I just mentioned. I think that water and sewer fees should be included on the list so that the city council has the flexibility to do things it might need to do to avoid increasing rates and harming that group of people. And so at the very least, if it became a choice of beginning impact fees or going up on rates, that's where that question would come into play. We don't know when that's going to be. And I want to be really clear about this because we had Blue speak to us for a full 2-hour session to talk about the ways the city can raise money. And I spent a considerable amount of time with him personally to dig into this issue. In regard to water and sewer, we're in a really peculiar situation right now in the city, and that is that 2019 was an anomalous year for water usage. And every year when the council does their budgeting, this year is going to be a critical budget process to this issue. They build their future projections based on the most recent year's usage. So that anomalously low water usage in 2019, which translates into anomalously low income to the city from selling water, affects those projections. So in the most recent budget cycle, that was very much in play. And based on those projections, beginning out in 2022, that income began to have a shortfall versus the cost of projects as projected in that budget, not by our consultant, but in the city budget at that time. So I think that it's important for the council to have that flexibility. I think it's also important that we have enough information to make solid recommendations to the council as to what that fee structure should look like. And so in my mind, the idea of them being included, but postponing the beginning of the collection of those fees for at least some period of time so that we have the new budget numbers in front of us and the ability to see whether 2019 was anomalous or not. So if 2020 looks like 19, maybe it's not an anomaly. And maybe that lower revenue collection is something that's just going to be in place and it needs to be taken into account. If 2020 returns to 2018 and 17 previous levels, then that's a very different thing. And so I think under the heading of fiscal responsibility, it would be irresponsible to exclude those items from the list of things on which impact fees could be exacted, and then put the city in a position where if they needed to look at beginning impact fees on water and sewer so as not to increase water and sewer rates, they would have to undertake an entirely new process like the one we've already been through. And so we've already seen how long this has taken. So the city says we need to look at water and sewer impact fees. Well, a year later, they're getting to the point of maybe being to the point of being able to put them in place. And so it just reduces their ability to respond and be flexible as we move along. Nobody knows what next year's water use is going to be, or the year after that. But I think it's important to provide as much flexibility as we can to the council. It's not a money grab on anyone's part. It's an effort on everyone's part to address the changed growth rate in Lubbock. And I've had people say to me, well, why can't the city just keep doing things the same way they have? It got us here. Well, the problem is it got us here $150 million upside down on the cost of roadway construction that needs to have been done at this point. And we don't want to see I don't want to see us address that by beginning impact fees on roadways and excluding the possibility of commencing impact fees for water and sewer if the time comes when they're needed. Anyone else have anything? Heather, you've been with us many times and all day today. Do you have any comments you'd like to share with us about last night, for example? You're muted, Heather. You're muted.
Okay, can you hear me now?
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Okay. Really, the only thoughts I had after thinking more about the population projection, that really has kind of come to the center of this discussion. And Thomas, I think a lot of your thoughts are very good thoughts, as well as everyone on this committee. At the time of the comp plan, many different growth rates were evaluated. And I believe I've heard it multiple times this morning, and it ties to your comment about have what we've been doing, does that work? And so I feel like the population projection estimate is a similar thought. It is, have we experienced a 2.5% growth rate? We have not, but the conversation at that time was, how do we put ourselves in the best position looking towards 2040? What type of population growth projection do we need to assume to get us there? And that was really a lot of the conversation that led to the 2.5% growth rate. So I went back and I looked at our presentation from that meeting during the comp plan, where we laid out multiple options, all the way from 1% up to 3%, as well as the various models that are used in different industries. And so the result of that discussion, if you look in the comp plan report, was a recommendation for a 2.5%. We also included a column at a 2.25%, but the overwhelming feel from the CPAC at that time was, if we want to be ready for this, we can't undershoot it. It needs to be a number that helps put Lubbock in a position to be successful. So that was just the only thought that maybe I wish I had made last night and failed to make.
Thank you. Does anyone else have any comments they'd like to make at this point about last night or any other issue at this point?
I know this will come up in future meetings as we get into rates and discounts, and the council has the ability to, at this point, I guess on the 23rd, to say yes or no in full to roadway, sewer, or water. But to your kind of in response to your comments about not knowing what's going to happen with sewer and water rates, if they're going to be able to keep up in the next 2 years, if we start using more water or not. And if we don't have sewer and water in the impact fee ordinance this first time around, that we could find ourselves getting in a hole or having to raise, rates, in some form or fashion, which is partly why I recommend that be studied based on the same kind of information we're using for our impact fee study. But my concern is that I understand if sewer and water don't make it into this ordinance, and then we get in a bind in the next 2 to 5 years, that this would have to be totally redone, repaid for, time spent to get sewer and water impact fees in an ordinance. I think, I understand the negatives there, but also want the committee to think about, and the council to think about, even if we set water and sewer at a 0 fee for this, until we can adjust that. I don't remember that every year, 6 months, we can, as a SEAC committee can recommend that the council does something to increase that, or the council can go and increase that. My fear is that, as soon as you make a tool available, that, the next SEAC committee or the next council, who we don't know who's going to be on those parties, would at some point grab that tool and misuse it for some reason, or take the rates from 0 to double what they're looked like today. So I don't know if we need the tool. There's nothing showing we have to have it right this second. So I just want that side of the conversation to be considered, and I think we'll flesh that out a little more as we go along over the next however long it is before we get our phase 2 in front of the council. But just wanted to make that point, not in opposition, but as just another way to look at the sewer and water piece of this.
Thomas, can I interject real quick? So Andy, just to be clear and to clarify that if council decides to do something on the 23rd, they're not approving anything on the 23rd. I mean, they could kill water and sewer on the 23rd. But even if they said, let's continue to study that, when we get to the second public hearing and the actual ordinance, they could choose to kill it then. And so even then we would have all the facts in front of them to make that educated decision. So I'm not
urging them to kill it on the 23rd. I'm just saying, as we progress in our conversations, that's another side of it that we need to know is an option to recommend as a committee.
Yeah, I get that, and I think you're right. I think just we need to be clear, because there's been some information that's put out there saying that they're going to adopt these. So even if they choose to adopt the land use, or they choose to adopt the report as is, they have not committed themselves to saying, yes, we're going to adopt water and sewer and set the rate at 0. That's not what they would be doing at the June, or the 23rd meeting is. So we just want to make sure that message is not getting out there, that if they choose to continue the study at that point, that doesn't mean that absolutely water and sewer are going to be in there.
Yeah, and I don't mind you making that clarification, because our committee has been beat over the head and understands your point, but we understand some public are just joining in today. And so I'm fine with you continuing to, and Thomas and everyone, making sure everyone's educated on what the vote is actually about.
Yep.
Thank you, Andy, and thank you, Mike. We are about to the end of our time today. I'd like to open a discussion about future meetings. And I'll put my thoughts out there first and then open it for comments. We have, I anticipate, only 2 more meetings at which we could conduct meetings in this format. Personally, and again, I have no knowledge, but I doubt the governor is going to extend our ability to have further Zoom meetings past June the 12th. And anticipating that, I would like for us to plan to have, to continue our weekly meeting next week, and on the 12th, if the 12th is possible. I think we're going to need to get some clarification from Kelly whether the order expires on the 12th or at midnight on the 11th. We need to be sure of that when we have our next meeting. But if we can have those 2 meetings in this format, I think that we should push forward and do that. I would like for us to plan next week for everyone to come ready to talk about the details of rates and discounts, and really start digging into the issue of what we think these rate structures should look like. I think in the next 2 meetings, we can make a lot of progress. At that point, the city council will have had their June 9th work session as of the second meeting out. We may glean some information from that about where we stand in the process. But then planning on our meeting that would be on June the 12th to then really reopen the discussion about how often we need to meet, given that A, those meetings will be in person, and B, we right now don't have a definitive path forward as far as our schedule is concerned. But I think that the further we can get in the short run, the more time we'll have later to refine the details rather than trying to figure out the general structure of what we think should happen. So now I'll be quiet. Does anybody have any comments? Okay, with that, then we'll plan to have our meeting next week. Mike, if you'll be sure that gets posted for us. And that will be just for the purpose of furthering the general discussion of impact fees and to start refining the details of what this committee thinks those should look like. Does anyone have anything else before we close? All right, with that said, I'm going to close our meeting for today. Thank you all for being here.
Thank you.
I'll see you next week. Thank you, Mrs. Cantu Franks.
You're welcome. Good one, guys.
Y'all take care. Thank you.
Bye.
Bye-bye.